So let me just say that I can't quite remember exactly how I first crossed paths with Dave, but it was definitely, even though I have vague recollection of the details, a good day for me. And that's because the work that we've been doing as part of this Sustainability Solutions Initiative that got launched more than 5 years ago was really about linking knowledge with action. So lots of different kinds of knowledge, university knowledge from all different fields, but of course the knowledge and know-how of all the people in the real world who struggle with these problems just as much as we do, probably more. And that's the knowledge part, but the action part can mean a lot of different things. But one thing it certainly means is regulatory and policy dimensions of the societal actions that we need to take. We needed real expertise and real energy to think about that, and a lot of it came in the form of Dave Owen, who is at the University of Maine School of Law. He was involved in many different SSI projects, sometimes formally and often as a kind of person who was just a go-to person to get to thinking about things. And I think he has a really fascinating background, but his interest in dams, and I have a little bit of that too, have always been a fun thing for me to learn a lot. And here he's working with another wonderful colleague, Colin Apps from the Nature Conservancy. And by the way, I hope it was all right. I put out some copies of the paper that you have forthcoming. And so if you're really interested in this, you want to find out more, there's papers back there next to John Peckenham. And I suspect if we run out of them, we can find a way to get you more. So thanks, Dave, for coming today to talk.
So thank you. It's really great to be here today. Good to see some familiar faces that I haven't seen in a while. And I want to preface this talk with just one comment. This is partly a talk about the Penobscot River Restoration Project. And I know that there are some people in this room who worked actively on that project. There are a lot of people across the state, and maybe some listening online as well, who deserve a lot of credit for what happened with the Penobscot project. Just to be clear, I am not one of those people. I did nothing to contribute to the Penobscot River Restoration Project. I'm just an interested observer who is trying to think about what else can be done with some of the concepts that underlay that project. My co-author, Colin Apps, was involved with the project to some extent, but I get none of the credit. It goes to other people. So the talk I'm giving today is really three stories intertwined with each other. One is a story about what we do with the enormous number of dams that we have in this country and in the world. The second story is about the frontiers for a concept, a legal concept known as an environmental trading system. And then the third story is about a really interesting restoration project taking place on the river that literally surrounds us on this island where we now sit. And the way those three stories fit together is that we think environmental trading systems have something constructive to offer to the future of dams. And we think the Penobscot River Restoration Project provides a useful starting point for thinking that through, a useful example. But as you will see from the talk that comes, that general thesis, that general conclusion comes with all sorts of caveats and qualifications, and I'll get to those in a little as I go through it. But at the outset, who cares? Why would you care about a talk about dams? And it may seem obviously a little bit more immediate here, where we're literally almost on the banks of the Penobscot River. But in general, in the circles in which I function, environmental and to some extent energy law circles, all the focus lately is on wind power and solar energy, fracking, a lot of other subjects. Nobody's really talking about dams. And so when I give this talk, I usually start out by trying to convince people that this is actually something worth caring about. And rather than starting in Maine for the why care, we'll go across the country and go to California for a moment, since among other things, that's the last place I gave this talk. And as you can see from the map of California on the left, there are a ton of dams in California. That's not all the dams in California, it's just some of them, and there are lots and lots of them. And the figure on the right shows California's major water delivery systems, the systems that take water from the northern coast ranges and the northern Sierra and get it down to the southern Central Valley and Los Angeles and San Diego. And those water systems are integrally dependent upon dams, multiple dams. So if somebody in LA drinks a glass of water, the molecules in that glass will have passed literally probably through hundreds of different dams. And those dams aren't important just because of sheer numbers. Staying with California for a moment, when we think about California and energy, we tend to think about things like solar power, million solar roofs, big solar installations in the desert, wind power at Altamont. Silicon Valley is very much invested in alternative energy. But if you look at where California actually gets its energy, and these stats are a couple years old, so they will have changed a little bit, obviously the biggest by far is natural gas. But second to natural gas isn't, I'm sorry, this is for electricity generation. For transportation fuels, the story would be a little bit different. Second leading source is hydro, ahead of all those other renewables that are getting all of the attention. And California, it turns out, isn't really atypical in this realm. We have tons and tons of dams across the country. That number, and that's dams in the Army Corps' inventory of large dams, that represents about a dam for every day that the country has been in existence. And then the dams that don't make it into the inventory because they're too small are vastly more numerous even than the large ones. So we have tons of dams in this country. And dams also, they have a lot of different functions they serve, but one in particular that is important is generating electricity. Now, 7% of the nation's electricity may not sound like a whole lot, but again, these statistics are a couple years old, so the gap will have closed, but at least a couple years ago, dams were generating more energy than more electricity than all other renewable sources combined. And you can see from this figure at the bottom right that the trend line for dam is roughly going down, for other sources is going slightly up. So that statistic will change. But still, dams remain a very, very important part of our energy picture. And of course, there are a lot of other things that dams do beyond generating energy. We tend to associate dams with hydropower, so a classic example of this. Most law students learn about this dam. It's a dam called the Tellico Dam, and it was at issue in a classic case called Tennessee Valley Authority versus Hill, which some of you might have heard of once upon a time as the snail darter case. And when the United States Supreme Court said that the dam could not be closed because closing the dam would adversely affect the snail darter, an endangered species, the press went nuts. It went utterly crazy. And one of the themes in the press coverage was just how loony it was to lose all that hydropower for the sake of a 2-inch long fish. Well, the Tellico Dam never generated hydropower. It was never built as a hydropower dam, was never intended to do so. It has never generated a single megawatt of power. And in that, it is actually quite typical. Most dams don't generate hydropower. And some of them serve other purposes. Some of them really serve no purpose at all. Some of them, we don't even know who the owners are. So that's both a big problem, but it's also potentially an opportunity. There are a lot of dams out there on the landscape that could perhaps generate hydropower if we wanted to install turbines and do something with them. And it turns out that this is a global story as well. Across the world, there are tons and tons of dams. And as you watch the global proliferation of dams, one thing that you'll notice is that we got built out a while ago in the more industrialized parts of the world. The United States hasn't really built major dams since the 1980s. But in other parts of the world, the dam building era is still very much ongoing. And this figure, again, gives you a sense of that. Those are planned dams. Those aren't existing dams. Those are things that are dams that are planned for development in South America. And if you're an environmentalist, and I definitely consider myself to be one, it is very difficult not to look at a map like that and just cringe in horror and think about the environmental consequences of building all those dams. And there are more benign ways environmentally for us to get our energy. But the reality with energy policy is that we often have to ask the question, compared to what? And realistically, compared to what? Because often the alternative to getting power from a dam that is at least politically feasible and likely is some sort of fossil fuel fired power generation. And there are circumstances, particularly if you're flooding a tropical forest, where a natural gas plant is probably far better for the climate and the environment than a new dam. But there are also circumstances, particularly if you're building on adding electricity at an existing dam site, where a dam looks much, much better for air quality reasons, for environmental reasons, than those options. With that said, the environmental impacts of dams are very significant. And one particular type of impact that's really a focus of this paper and this study is upon fish passage. So dams generally block fish passage. Even if they have fish passage facilities, not every fish is going to make it through those facilities, and there is also the problem of passing fish downstream and getting them through turbines without chopping them up. So dams are a major impediment to fish migrations. And to some people, this might seem like a sort of minor issue, sort of inconveniencing a few fly fishermen and deep nature lovers, but not really anybody else. The reality is that a lot of our coastal river systems on both the East Coast and the West Coast were just once spectacularly fecund places with enormous populations of fish, populations of migratory fish so large that these were really significant economic resources, significant sources of poor protein for poor people, and not just a sort of aesthetic or recreational benefit, although they were that as well. And we know that partly from historical, and particularly on the East Coast, partly from some of the things that very, very excited colonists said when they saw what an undammed river, something that they hadn't really seen as much of in their native Europe, just how many fish it could hold. And in part because of these impacts, there recently has been a trend towards dam removal. We've been taking increasing numbers of dams out. But the numbers of dams that have been removed are still minuscule in comparison to the overall number of dams in this country. And so the dam removal trend, while it's been very widely celebrated, is still not really a major impact on large numbers of river systems. So why is that? Well, this gets us to the legal part of the talk, although the reasons aren't entirely legal. To understand why it is that we have so many dams that aren't generating hydropower when perhaps they could be, and also that are causing major environmental impacts when probably there's no good economic reason or other reason for them to do so, you have to understand a little bit about the law of dams. And to understand the law of dams, I think it's helpful to break it down, or break dams down into three general categories. So one is dams that are privately or state or municipally owned but are regulated by the federal government because they generate hydropower. So the second category is dams that the federal government itself owns. And the third category are dams that either don't generate hydropower or generate hydropower but on non-navigable streams and are not owned by the federal government. That's the default category that's regulated by the states. Take each of these in turn. First off, dams that generate hydropower and are on navigable streams are regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And the FERC regulatory process it's very complicated, but it has a few important and distinctive features. One is that FERC issues licenses to dams, and these licenses are for 30 to 50-year terms, 40 years is typical. Second, when a dam is up for license renewal, there is extensive environmental review of the environmental impacts of that dam, not just under the Federal Power Act, but under a whole host of other environmental statutes as well. Third, in the intervening years, when a dam is not up for relicensing, there isn't a whole lot of environmental oversight over the dam. It's not necessarily entirely left alone, but often pretty close to that. And then fourth, the Federal Power Act does have a provision that requires FERC to make individual licensing decisions in the context of a broader plan. FERC has more or less told the world that that provision of the Federal Power Act is legally meaningless, and it has somehow managed to get the courts to agree. And so as a consequence, it is very rare that dam renewals or license renewals are done in the context of a broader watershed plan where FERC looks at multiple dams at the same time. They really tend to be one-off exercises. Then there are the dams that the federal government owns. These are dams like the Hoover Dam and the Grand Coulee Dam. They tend to be some of the biggest ones, some of the biggest power generators, and the ones with some of the largest environmental impacts. They are typically governed by congressional statutes that originally authorized their construction, by subsequent water power or federal water statutes, that Water Resource Development Acts that govern dam management. And then they are touched in a number of different ways, although to varying degrees, by other environmental statutes. But still, once these dams are built and authorized, there is nothing akin to a relicensing procedure. There's no moment when we step back and say, does this dam still make sense? Should we radically change the way that we are operating the dam unless the agency responsible for the dam wants to engage in that process? And you can imagine how often that happens. Third, we have all the other dams. These are the dams regulated by the states. And there's very little legal literature on how these are regulated, so Colin and I, with the help of some RAs, really had to do a lot of digging to develop a picture of state regulation of dams. But what we found in a survey of a select set of states, first off, is that there's very little environmental oversight of existing state dams. So once a dam is built, none of the states we looked at had any formal procedural requirement to re-examine it later on. And a lot of state dams were built before there really were environmental laws. So essentially these dams were built and operated outside of any sort of environmental oversight. No relicensing procedures, and even safety oversight, while sometimes robust on the books, tends to be very, very, very lax in practice. So as a practical matter, if you are an owner of a state-regulated dam, generally the most simple thing you can do from a legal perspective with your dam is nothing at all. It's certainly not to add in new hydropower capacity or even to propose to take out. So the upshot of all of this is that we have a system of dam regulation that is very spotty, that does not provide incentives to think comprehensively about the system of dams that we have, even on a watershed scale, and that doesn't create a whole lot of leverage for people to think about doing something differently with dams once they're created. And so, really, given this legal structure, should be no surprise that we have a sort of dated and not particularly efficient from an economic standpoint or not particularly helpful from an environmental standpoint system of dams. So is there a better way? Well, we think there is, and we think that the Penobscot River Restoration Project provides a hopeful example. Now, I know that probably some of you know this project far better than I do, but for the benefit of those of you who are not as familiar with it, I'm just going to give a very, very quick overview of what happened and what's going with the Penobscot River, and what the key lessons are that we take away from it. So first off, here's the watershed. As many of you know, it's beautiful up there. There's lots of woods. There are still Atlantic salmon, as well as a number of other anadromous species in the watershed. And there's a lot of really good habitat. I mean, a lot of the fish that live in this watershed are, to some extent, forest creatures. They do best in watersheds that are relatively undeveloped. And there's still a lot of woods up there. So all of that makes this potentially very valuable habitat. And again, traditionally, lots and lots of different anadromous species lived in this watershed, and they lived in the sort of abundance that inspired sort of that overwritten prose that I showed you an example of a little while earlier. That, by the way, those earlier quotes were from John Smith, and I think he was using some of the same facility with language that he used to woo Pocahontas. But there's lots of dams in the watershed. And this density of dams is actually, by East Coast river standards, really fairly low. If this were the Hudson River watershed, for example, the density would be much, much higher. But still, that's a lot of dams. It's enough to have a pretty significant impact on migratory fish. And in the late 90s, early 2000s, an interesting situation developed with the dams in this area in the lower watershed. First, a few of the dams were coming up for FERC licensing renewal at around the same time. And second, those dams fell into consolidated ownership. Often that doesn't happen. Often you'll have dams with different owners interspersed throughout a watershed. But here, ownership was consolidated. There was active opposition to those renewals from environmental groups, from the Penobscot Indian tribe. And those groups had enough leverage through the Federal Power Act process that they could threaten to make things very difficult for the dam owner. And so the upshot of this, and simplifying a long and complicated process, is that led to negotiations, and the negotiations ultimately led to a deal. And under the terms of the deal, the environmental groups would buy out for $25 million 3 of the dams in the river. And so they would take 2 of those dams out and put state-of-the-art fish passage at a 3rd dam and operate it for run-of-the-river flows. So what will this do? Well, this is kind of a busy figure. It's a little bit hard to see, but basically the warm colors, the oranges and the yellows, represent areas, and the reds represent areas where the fish have to go through a lot of dams to get to the habitat. The blues and the greens represent areas where they do not have to go through quite as many dams. And of course, even if there is fish passage, each fish passage facility that fish have to pass through lowers the odds of them making it further upstream. How much depends on the type of fish and the type of facility, but there's always that effect. So if you look at some of these before and after comparisons, you can see that there are major increases in access in some parts of this watershed. Depending on the species, we're talking as much as hundreds of miles of additional access. And then for some of the species that don't get as many miles of access, the percentage changes. And these are species that are really dependent on this lower part of the river. The percentage changes are much larger. So a huge benefit to fish. Just one example of what this might mean for populations. Now I know these are highly uncertain projections, and there are probably people in this room who are studying these projections right now and trying to see what the reality will be in comparison to the projections. But still, the preliminary estimate is that we're going to have a lot more fish in this watershed because of this project. Now, if that was the whole story, that'd be a really exciting environmental restoration project. But it's not the whole story. By upgrading power equipment on some of the remaining dams, and also by making some other adjustments like raising pool heights where dams are going to remain in place, the original estimate was that almost all of the hydropower generating capacity that pre-existed the project would be retained. More recent estimates put capacity after the project actually higher than it was before. Now, you will talk to people who will say, well, that's nice, but if you'd taken out all of those dams, you could have even greater improvements for fish. And I've also heard somebody say, well, if you left all those dams in, you could have even more hydropower. And I think that's all true. But I think to most people, this trade, this exchange of keeping the most of the hydropower or even taking slightly more and getting a massive increase in habitat access for anadromous fish looks really good. Looks like something we ought to try to replicate. And the basic starting point or the premise of our paper was that it would be worthwhile to try to think about how law could facilitate that kind of replication. Before I say that, though, just a couple of other, these are simplified scenarios where we might see this sort of trading take place. Another one is, imagine we've got two rivers, we've got dams on both, the dams don't have fish passage, so both rivers are blocked. Well, what if you said to a company, take out dam D, but you can build one over here? We would still have the same number of dams, we might have similar generating capacity, but now you've completely opened up a river system. Probably a good trade for the environment. Another example of a type of trade we might do, and this one is not hypothetical, this essentially is a part of the Edwards Dam removal deal. You've got a company that wants to build out into a wetland area, and you've got an upstream dam that's blocking fish passage. And let's say that the wetland area is just not very biologically valuable. Well, maybe your deal is they get to fill the wetland if they take out the dam. And again, that might make a ton of economic sense for the company, which was the case with Bath Iron Works, and be a far bigger ecological gain for the river than leaving the wetland and the dam in place. So what's going on in all of these scenarios, both the hypothetical ones and the real ones, is a form of exchange, where we're basically trading the retention of hydropower or the retention of some other benefit that a dam provides for essentially having environmental groups say that's okay as long as we get dam removals and environmental improvements someplace else. And if we're trying to think about how to strike that sort of deal elsewhere, we think it's useful to look at the law of environmental trading systems and see what lessons we can learn from it. And so, what's an environmental trading system? Well, let me step back and explain that a little bit and what we've learned from these systems, and then we'll see how that concept might apply in the concept of dams. So, the classic environmental trading system, the example people use most often, involves air pollution emissions. And the basic concept here, well, let me step back. In the 1970s, when the Clean Air Act was first passed, the primary regulatory approach was to impose relatively uniform controls on all industrial facilities within a particular category. So everybody basically had to meet the same performance standards. The lawyers loved it because it was simple, transparent, relatively enforceable. The economists hated it. And the economists basically said, look, instead of doing that, why don't you put a cap on the aggregate amount of emissions that are allowed? And if someone can reduce his plant's emissions by a greater amount, let him sell a credit. Because the reality is some of these facilities are going to be able to reduce their emissions much more cheaply than others. And so if you allow those facilities that can make the cheap reductions to do so to a greater extent and then sell credits, well, you'll wind up with the same aggregate emissions and the same environmental impact, but you'll do so at a much greatly reduced economic cost. That was the basic concept. We do something similar with wetlands. So you've probably all heard the phrase no net loss. The idea is that we have this national policy of no net loss of wetlands. And yet, routinely we build highway projects and shopping malls and other things that involve destroying wetlands. How do we do that? Well, the basic premise of the regulatory system is that you compensate for the destruction of wetlands by restoring or creating wetlands at some other location. We call it compensatory mitigation. And so it's a somewhat different model, but the basic premise of exchanging environmental benefits in some locations for permission to do otherwise forbidden things in other locations, the same premise is there. This basic concept is now all over the field of environmental law. So Kathleen and Caroline, you guys have conquered my field. And we do this in lots and lots of different realms. And these systems vary. There's a lot of differences, for example, between emissions trading in the air quality context, where you tend to have lots of different participants in the markets, relatively low transaction cost deals, relatively fungible things being dealt, versus, say, the wetlands or habitat context, in which the markets are often much thinner, the trades have much higher transaction costs, and really what emerges often looks more like a barter system than anything an economist would recognize as a market. But the same basic premise of using trades to achieve environmental goals with greater economic efficiency is there in all these realms. So does it work? Well, clearly the answer is sometimes yes. And the most famous or the most frequently trotted out example of a success is the acid rain trading program created under the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. And this set up a cap and trade system for sulfur dioxide. And as you can see here from this figure on the left, dramatic reductions in emissions. Over here, you can see dramatic differences between the projected costs of alternative regulatory approaches and the actual costs here. Now, there's some arguments among environmental economists, environmental lawyers, about how realistic these projections really were. People have said, well, we always overestimate costs, so the difference isn't as great. But at least we know that this worked in terms of producing the environmental outcome we wanted. It worked in terms of getting political buy-in from the regulated entities. And it also produced costs that were significantly lower than those that were projected, however realistic those projections were. But the other lesson is clearly this sometimes doesn't work at all. And dams actually provide one good example of the problems we sometimes have. For a very long time, the basic deal with dam construction was, okay, you get to build a dam and block fish passage, but you can compensate by building a fish hatchery. And this was often disastrously ineffective because it turns out that hatchery fish also need functioning rivers to survive. And yet, this was sort of the fig leaf that allowed people to rationalize building lots of dams and say, oh, we're not destroying anything, even as the evidence was fairly plain that they were and that the compensation wasn't working. And there are lots of other examples on both sides throughout the field of environmental regulation. And the broad lesson that we take from them is that environmental trading systems are an intriguing and very valuable tool, but not in every situation, and not unless they are very carefully designed and very carefully implemented. And that obviously has potentially mixed messages if we're trying to adapt this sort of system to dams. To break it down a little bit more, we think that a couple key lessons emerge from the literature and from past experiences on environmental trading systems that might guide us in thinking first about whether this is a viable approach for dams, and second, about what reforms might make it work better. And so, very generally, we've put these three categories of criteria, or sets of criteria, to three larger categories. So first off, legal authorization. Any environmental trading system is typically set up and administered by a government agency, whether it's EPA or Fish and Wildlife Service, the Army Corps of Engineers. And the general rule of thumb in administrative law is those agencies can only do the things that Congress gives them permission to do. May sound fairly basic, but this has been a real issue for EPA in recent years, as it has tried to set up carbon, or not so much carbon, but conventional air pollution trading systems that that it thought made a lot of sense, and that the courts looked at and said, well, it's just not consistent with the statute you're supposed to be implementing. The latest round of EPA's efforts has been upheld by the US Supreme Court, which overturned a lower court decision. So it seems to be on an okay footing now. But the basic lesson is, before we say, oh, this is a good idea economically and environmentally, we should do it, we have to look at whether the law allows it. And so one of the tasks in researching this paper was just to see if there were any direct legal prohibitions on the trading of dams. And happy news, I don't think there are. There are a lot of ways in which law creates subtle or not so subtle disincentives, and some in which it creates incentives. But the legal prohibitions aren't there. So that's good news for the potential for trading dams. The story gets a little bit more complicated when we look at incentives. And almost any sort of environmental change in behavior typically happens in response to regulatory hammers and financial carrots. And so we looked at both of those, and particularly because I'm a lawyer, the regulatory hammers. But we'll start with the incentives. And of course, the big incentive to get people to do things differently with dams, in one way or another, is going to be money. Simply put, if dams aren't valuable, people aren't going to be inclined to do anything with them, to put them into place. We're not going to have as much of a pool of money to do mitigation with, and therefore there's likely to be less trading that occurs. Of course, people also might be more inclined to take them out, but because taking them out takes money, you need to generate a source of that somehow. Well, the one point here is that this is an area where dams really get caught up in our larger energy and environmental policies and our climate policies. Because the amount of money, the value of dams, particularly, obviously primarily hydropower dams, is dependent on how competitive hydropower is with respect to other energy sources. And so, as soon as we get around to putting a price on carbon, one of many ancillary benefits of taking that step is likely to be to make hydropower a little bit more appealing. Again, that may lead people to not want to take dams out. That's obviously one potential consequence. But another consequence is if you make dams more valuable for hydropower, you potentially have the economic resource that can be skimmed to some extent to create mitigation funding that might allow us to trade some dams remaining in place for others coming out. So the other incentive that really matters here is regulatory leverage. Trading usually happens in response to a regulatory hammer. And the simplest one is a cap. There's no cap with dams. We don't have any sort of national, no net loss of river function policy or anything akin to the kinds of caps we see in the air quality context. But we do have a lot of regulatory levers that might encourage people to think about doing something different with a dam, or discourage them from leaving a dam in place when it's environmentally destructive. But the catch is that at the federal level, those levers really only come to bear on dams when dams are up for license renewal. So that's potentially once every 40 years. And the license renewal process itself can last for 10 years, so it still goes on for a while, but still, it's not most of the time, and there's no effort to coordinate it so that happens on multiple dams in the same watershed at the same time. For federally owned dams and for state-regulated dams, that leverage may not really come to bear at all. Indeed, for state-regulated dams, the dam owner may not even know that the dam owner owns the dam. About 14% of our dams have unknown ownership. So we're really falling far short on creating the sort of regulatory leverage that might compel people to think about doing something different with a dam and say, maybe, hey, I'd like to just take this out, and maybe if I take my dam out, I can create some mitigation credits that I can sell to somebody else, that will let him leave his dam in and upgrade it and add hydropower. So the paper itself has a long list of ways in which we suggest that states and the federal government might ratchet up regulatory oversight of dams and encourage people to think about doing something different. Third key challenge is information. And in some of the early literature, and I think this is probably more in the legal literature on environmental trading systems, people said what we now know to be some very naive things about how environmental trading systems would be so much easier for regulators because they wouldn't need all this knowledge. They just set up a simple market and then just let the knowledge of the market drive the reforms. Well, we now know that environmental trading systems actually take a tremendous amount of information and thought to set up. And in some cases also to administer. And one reason for that is that often we're trading things that are incommensurable. We're trading apples and oranges. And if we want, because no two habitats are exactly the same, no two river systems are exactly the same, location matters, environmental context matters. And if we want to ensure that the trades that we make produce environmental benefits as well as making economic sense for the traders, that takes regulatory oversight, and it takes a lot of information. So for dams, that sounds like a potentially very daunting lesson, because river systems are very complex. It takes a lot of information to have even a rudimentary understanding of the of the consequences of doing something that alters a river system. And dams also tend to be embedded in complicated legal webs. There are going to be a lot of people with property rights up and down that river. In the western United States, there are going to be a lot of people with claims on the water in the river. And so all of this can make any sort of change to river management something that has all kinds of ripple effects, and it takes a lot of information to understand. So that's the downside of the story. On the bright side, we've made huge advances in recent years in our ability to gather and manage that kind of information. So I'll show you a couple examples. This is a figure from a study that my co-author participated in, where they developed, with the cooperation of Fish and Wildlife Service folks and people from a whole bunch of other government agencies, they developed metrics for evaluating which dams made the most ecological sense for removal. And then they created priority systems. And these metrics just focus on individual dams, but you can also do optimization modeling where you look at how you might prioritize sequences of dam removals to maximize benefits. Another example, the Department of Energy has been putting a ton of effort in recent years into identifying places where we could do power upgrades on existing dams. And so this has given us a sense of where the potentially promising locations are to add more energy capacity into existing systems. More recently, DOE has been heading up a couple of studies to try to figure out how to put these pieces together. And so they're doing basin scale modeling to try to identify win-win opportunities to do something sort of like what happened in the Penobscot and other watersheds. What they haven't done, and what we're trying to do, is figure out the legal piece of going from identifying these options to actually making them happen. And then finally, we are starting to see some regulatory guidance that provides essentially model rules for people who are trying to enter into dam trading. So North Carolina has been the leader here. A couple of years ago, it developed and has since rescinded regulatory guidance on using dam removals to mitigate for wetland impacts. We think this was a valiant first effort, and that there's probably going to need to be a lot more guidance like this for this idea to go into effect. So where does that leave us? When we started the project, Colin and I were really kind of hoping that we would find that what happened in the Penobscot River was broadly replicable, and that we would identify 2 or 3 simple reforms that would really make that happen. And the picture that emerges instead is much messier than that. There are a lot of challenges that face this basic idea of trading dams. There are a lot of places where we think it will not work. But with all of that said, we think the idea does have promise, and that we think that with some reforms and with some learning and some education, it's an idea that could be utilized in a number of other places, even if not everywhere. So with that, I'll stop, and I'm happy to take your questions. Yeah, so this is I think, I mean, there's a number of very thorny questions that this idea raises. This is one of them, and it's not just an abstract question. I mean, this is what, so to give you another context where this issue comes up, there are other parts of the world in which governments have basically said, we are building dams. You cannot stop us, we are building them. Nature Conservancy, come tell us how to do it with a relatively low impact. And the Nature Conservancy then comes in and does what it calls dams by design. And the idea is to try to create not the configuration we started out with in the Penobscot, but something closer to what we ended up with. And what all of those TNC scientists, I think what keeps them up in the middle of the night is thinking, what's the proper comparison here? Am I greenwashing a project and allowing this environmental destruction to go forward? Or am I mitigating the effects of environmental destruction that would have been much worse but for my intervention? And I know, I mean, from talking to them, they worry about this. This is not, I think they do it because they think the answer is the latter, but they're not 100% sure sometimes. So in this context, I think there are a couple of reasons why I think the concept is worth imitating, but with a caveat. So the first reason is we're not taking out very many dams. So we would like to be in this world where dams simply come out, and it's understood that there's, the dam is a burden on a river is a public resource, a fishery is a public resource. The dam should just come out without needing the push of compensation or a mitigation or a trade. But that's not what's happening very much. Some, but not nearly as much as it probably should, given the ecological impacts of the dams that are remaining. And so one motivation of this paper was trying to think, how can we do more than nibble at the edges? How can we accelerate that process of dam removal? The other way that we've tried to answer that concern in this paper is that most of our recommendations are not, there should be a massive fundraising effort so that we can have more $25 million buyouts. It's, we should have a lot more regulatory oversight of dams, because one thing regulatory oversight does, as a practical matter, is it can sometimes internalize some of the externalities that the dam owner was creating. So using the Kennebec River as an example, the FERC process, I mean, that dam made sense for nobody but its owners. And it was only the regulatory authority of the FERC process that forced them to grapple with the externalities that they were creating. So we want more of that. And I think that won't make your concern go away, but it would alleviate it, I think, a little bit.
Sort of a follow-up to Cheryl's question. These are the high-profile projects, the big power dams, and the ones you mentioned have some unique circumstances that allow them to go forward. But I think cumulatively, the large number, the 97% you mentioned of non-power dams on the landscape, have a much greater impact. And they should be the low-hanging fruit. We should be able to get those taken out without much trouble. But even the small dams face the same challenge as the large one. How do you pay for them? Even when the dam serves no purpose anymore, nobody wants to step up and pay for its removal. Or if you have any thoughts on how to accomplish that?
Yeah, so a couple. One is, so let's start with the most basic. One is we suggested there should be dam registries. That if you own a dam, there are dams in a state, there should be registries where every dam and its owner have to be registered. And one consequence of that, so Pennsylvania has piloted this. Pennsylvania, when it identified dams, would send letters to dam owners and say, hey, you have a dam. If your dam breaks, you're liable. If somebody gets hurt at your dam, you're liable. And so that just made people, and oh, by the way, if you want to take your dam out, we have some funding and we'll help you through the regulatory process. So, and Wisconsin also had a dam removal fund. Even if you leave the fund aside, just letting people know the economic consequences of the dam they have, sometimes, and the fact that they own it, they may not have realized that, that can spur the owner sometimes to put some money into the process. Beyond that, there are a few ideas in the paper. So one is to create a revolving loan fund where basically dams come out or there's money that's put up for, well, one is to have dam owner fees. You charge every dam owner in the state an annual fee of something like $100 to have a dam. That changes the economic calculus for the owner. It also creates potentially a pool of funding to fund removals. Another one is to create a revolving loan fund that would fund basin scale planning in hopes of producing the kind of win-win situation that you had in the Penobscot, where some of the economic benefits of that basin scale planning are then kicked back into the fund. And there's a few other ideas we have in the paper as well. It's not always going to work, but the premise is that even subtle shifts of the economic calculus might make this a more viable idea in a lot of places. There are a lot of, even in a state that's relatively concerned with its dams and fish passage, there are a lot of big information gaps.
In the removal of dams, do issues come up about the loss of human history, for example, as a complicating factor?
Oh yeah, in a couple of ways. One is you could have a National Historic Preservation Act issue. The dam itself could be treated as a historic structure. And then the broader way is that if a dam's in place long enough, the reservoir behind it can come to take on some elements of being sort of a community resource. And people I've talked to who've done small-scale dam removals talk about this. This is a real challenge, is the sense that you're used to a sense of public property rights being something that drives environmental protection. Often our sense that a river is a public resource is something that is cited as an argument in favor of environmental protection or what we might think of as positive environmental change. But communities have a sense of ownership of the dam and the reservoir. I mean, to give one example, I learned to skate and learned to play hockey on basically a dam, a mill pond in Massachusetts. And it was a community park in the winters. Hundreds of people would be out there. And so the dam itself there has become embedded in the history of the community in a way that makes the community reluctant to give it up. And I think sometimes that's a very good argument for not giving it up. And that dam was a valuable dam in a lot of ways because it created a park where people could get together and do this. But a lot of dams that don't have that function.
So, I don't know which categories of dams fall into this in terms of the federally owned versus regulated versus the state regulated, but dams have a life expectancy.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of them civil engineers feel are approaching their the sort of life expectancy that was forecast, particularly it's sort of like a baby boom of dams, right, from the
Mm-hmm.
50s that are coming up on when something has to happen, and it's never been completely clear to me what has to happen. In other words, they'll become more unsafe, and these are big dams, not the 2 million spared old dams.
Mm-hmm.
How does this enter in here? In other words, somebody at some point is going to have to say, we're going to have to spend a lot of money to either take these dams down or more likely get them so they can go another 50 to 70 years. Does that enter into this in any interesting way?
I think it does. I mean, I think the unsafety of dams is a serious public health problem and a major environmental opportunity. And it's a major environmental opportunity because an unsafe dam is a dam that somebody's got to do something with. They may not realize it, again, because they may not realize they own it or they may not be paying attention. But if we had robust safety inspections, then that would be something that would instigate rethinking the uses of dams. Sometimes, a dam that fails a safety inspection, that failed safety inspection might be what gets somebody to think, hey, I've got a great hydropower resource here. I ought to be upgrading it and putting in hydropower. And I think that, sometimes that's a very appropriate answer. But sometimes that is going to be what spurs somebody to think, I don't want this. I don't want this liability. The best thing to do is take it out. John?
Dave, does the recent reinterpretation of the waters of the United States play into the small state-regulated dams and what happens with them if it happens?
Let me think about that for a second. I don't think it's going to matter much. So what John is referring to is under the Clean Water Act, the federal government has jurisdiction over navigable waters, but then the Clean Water Act defines that term in a nonsensical way. It defines it as the waters of the United States. And so everybody in the legal world agrees that that's broader than just waters that are actually navigable. But how much broader has been an issue in multiple Supreme Court cases, and now EPA and the Army Corps have just come out with new rules that would clarify that jurisdiction and extend it to a greater extent to basically small ephemeral streams. Well, not extend it. I think if you talk to Army Corps people, they say this is what we've been doing. It just clarifies it. But clarifies jurisdiction, federal jurisdiction over ephemeral and intermittent streams. So I guess the argument would be that that clarifies that those streams and the waters behind them are subject to federal jurisdiction. And therefore somebody who is making a change to those waterways probably needs a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. The reality is, I don't think that's going to be a huge change in practices, despite what you might hear from the Farm Bureau, which is apoplectic about these proposed changes. I don't think it's going to be a big difference on the ground.
Well, let's thank Dave again for a great talk.